Epilepsy is quite common. There's about 600,000 children in North America with epilepsy. About a third of those have what's called drug-resistant epilepsy, meaning despite adequate trials of a drug to treat epilepsy, an anticonvulsant, they're still having seizures. And so we call that DRE, drug-resistant epilepsy. A subset of those children will be candidates for some form of what's known as epilepsy surgery. That involves taking out that part of the brain that is causing the seizures, the focus of epilepsy. And so epilepsy surgery has been around for quite a while, though there are some children who we don't find a focus of their epilepsy. And so we don't know where the seizures are coming from, or we know they're coming from different parts of the brain. And so just removing one part of that brain isn't going to help. And that's where the development of neurotechnologies has played a role. The oldest of which is something called vagal nerve stimulation, where an electrode is placed along the vagus nerve in the neck and then hooked up to a generator that stimulates that nerve. And by mechanisms that are still relatively unclear, can bring about a reduction in both the frequency and intensity of seizures.
Deep brain stimulation is a technology that we have at our disposal to implant electrodes in the center of the brain, in a part of the brain called the thalamus, to deliver very precise electrical stimulation to that part of the brain. And when we do that, we essentially render the brain less likely to generate seizures.
And there are other techniques that are refining the more resective procedures that we do. Many centers, including here in Vancouver, are using what's called robot-assisted stereo EEG, where small electrodes are implanted in different parts of the brain. And then over a period of days, or sometimes even weeks, we record seizures in that child. And that allows us to create a 3D map of where the seizures are coming from and help guide surgery to remove the focus. There's a relatively new technique called responsive neurostimulation. That's what we call a closed loop system. So it has the ability of both recording a seizure and when a seizure starts, stimulating a part of the brain in the hopes of stopping that seizure.
Now, these technologies aren't for everybody. Patient selection and choosing the right candidate who would benefit is really extremely critical. But I think it's very important for patients, for children, for families to know that there are options that could potentially improve their quality of life.
The neuroethical issues that go along with drug-resistant epilepsy are huge. Uncontrolled seizures change the brain. It impacts on how a child develops or doesn't develop. So the whole concept of risk and benefit, the whole issue of information and consent, how these technologies might change us as people, we don't know that. Our goal is to control seizures, reduce their frequency, and try to minimize any unintended consequences. But because the newness of them is such that we may not know what those consequences will be 5 or 10 years from now.
When you're considering a child to implant with these devices, we obviously want to implant the one that would work the best for the individual child. But we also, if we're not sure which one will work better, we want to start with the one that's least invasive. As these devices become more widely available and widely used, we're obviously going to generate a wealth of information about how they should be used and in whom these technologies should be applied. The future of neurotechnologies will certainly have a lot more evidence that we can use to guide decisions around individual patients.
It's very easy as a neurosurgeon, but perhaps even more so as a parent, to hope for the best and be very enthusiastic about how a treatment is going to work, especially if it does work. But that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. When you're explaining to a family what intervention you're recommending, to make sure that they understand that it might not work. You hope that it does, and you go in selecting patients to maximize the chance that it will. And even in those where we see a dramatic benefit, we still don't know what the potential long-term effects of that will be. So we have to make sure that we're helping families understand that we still don't know what it may mean in the long term.
And these gaps in knowledge are something that we freely acknowledge. We know that there's a lot we don't know about the brain itself and how neurotechnologies interface with the brain and modify seizures.
I think what we're seeing now is just the tip of the iceberg. The advances we're making to make devices even smaller and smaller, new devices, new ways of recording seizures, I think are going to result in the relatively near future in new technologies.
I think the more that we accept that these technologies can help patients and make them available from a systemic perspective, the better off our patients will be.